As Judith was saying, it's hard to say whether I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because we are straddling a kind of 15-hour time zones. It's almost midnight here in Hong Kong, and quite early for our speaker, Dr. Robin Reineke from Arizona State. So we're very delighted to have her this morning. Thank you so much, Robin, for joining us. This is the second webinar in our series this semester, in our this current series. We announced a third talk on May 11th to be delivered by Professor Daniel Folliard from France, but unfortunately we're going to have to reschedule that because he has recently informed us that because of the protests and all of that in France, his schedule has been disrupted, and he's now having to give his final exam to his students on the day when he was scheduled to speak for us. So we will keep you informed about that. That's going to happen sometime in June, most likely. So do watch out for that. And we're also doing something a little bit different this time with our webinar. We have a discussant, and that is Dr. Roberto Castillo, who is assistant professor in the Cultural Studies Department at Lingnan University. Thank you so much, Roberto, for taking this on and joining us today.
Thank you, Vidisha.
So I'm going to hand it over to Roberto to introduce our speaker and to get us started today. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Vidisha. Hi, everyone. Good night from Hong Kong. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I think it is not so often that we have interinstitutional cultural studies collaborations in Hong Kong. I don't know exactly why, but it's good that they're starting to happen. So I'm very happy to be here. As Vidisha just told you, my name is Roberto Castillo. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University. And it's my pleasure to be here with you to discuss and have a conversation with Robin. Robin Reineke is a sociocultural anthropologist, for those of you who may not know her, with specializations in transnational migration, science and technology studies, forensic anthropology, and the anthropology of violence, death, and the dead body. Her research and fieldwork are focused on the US-Mexico border region, especially the Sonoran Desert. From 2006 to 2020, she worked closely with the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, where she carried out both ethnographic fieldwork and the forensic anthropology of human identification. In 2013, Reineke co-founded the Colibri Center for Human Rights, which she directed until 2019. So Robin is going to be giving us a talk titled Unauthorized DNA, Border Disappearances, and Forensic Illegality on the US-Mexico border. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Robin. So Robin, you have the floor for as long as you want, but you said maybe half an hour. So for the audience to know, and then maybe we'll have a conversation and then we'll open to the floor. Thank you very much, Robin. All yours.
Great. Well, greetings and good morning from Tucson, Arizona. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to know about your program. I'm just very thankful that I'm learning about what you all do and making new friends and colleagues here. So many thanks for the invitation. I will go ahead and share my screen. And it's always hard to see the slideshow. Okay. So this is an article that I'm working on right now. So it's a nice opportunity to share some unpublished work and some thinking that I'm doing. And I eagerly await feedback and questions from you all that always, especially from people in the same conversations about death and disappearance and ethics and postmortem care and forensics. It's going to be helpful. So I will limit my my contributions today so that we have time for discussion. Just a note before I begin. Roberto kindly shared my bio, but I want to highlight that I am a practitioner scholar. This is a little bit more unusual for sociocultural anthropologists than for forensic anthropologists. I have combined those two skill sets, and I joined a community here in Tucson that I should mention. It's not just government, but importantly, it involves a number of non-state actors who use forensic science and other forms of knowledge to find and identify those who've disappeared in the border between Mexico and the United States. As was mentioned, I co-founded the Colibri Center for Human Rights in 2013. And then in 2019, moved over completely to be at the university as a researcher. My comments, my observations that I'm going to be discussing in this talk come more from lived experience in the work of forensic human identification over the past 15 years than from research. So the quotes from the families that I'm going to include come from IRB authorized research. I'll mention when I'm especially paraphrasing things especially said to me by government actors, government employees, that were really said to me not in the context of research, but in the context of NGO work to identify the dead. I also want to introduce where I am and where the place where I'm focused today, which is the Sonoran Desert. I feel an obligation and a duty to introduce this place beyond how it sometimes is discussed in the literature about death and disappearance on the border. It's a sacred place to Tohono O'odham people. I am speaking to you from the traditional homelands of the O'odham people. And it's a place that provided and continues to provide safety, nourishment, meaning, tradition, and history to O'odham people. It's not inherently a dangerous place, and I would like to flag a growing and important literature coming from post-colonial studies of critiques of the entire concept of desert as being a colonial construction. So this is a place of meaning. It's a place that is somewhat understood traditionally to have dangers, but there's a human place and there's a wild place within the desert. There are human places and there are wild places within the desert. So I guess just to kind of flag that this place is not a killing fields. It is not defined by the dead. It's not defined by the killing power of the desert. It's unfortunately kind of a colonial romantic narrative to frame the desert that way. Our award-winning MacArthur Genius poet, Dr. Ofelia Zepeda at the University of Arizona, has written some just very powerful poetry about this place and how it's also being abused in the project of ethno-nationalism by the United States in the project of border control. So my goals today, before I get into the ethnographic content, just to kind of foreshadow so you have a sense of where I'm going. Number one, to point out that border disappearances are not just caused by US federal policies at the border, but also by forensic policies and practices that are at the local level along the border and federally. So we need to be looking at forensic bureaucracy when we're looking at disappearance. With the death at the border, that's been discussed and framed very accurately in terms of US border policies, and I'll get into that momentarily. But when we take a look and when we center disappearance as a problem in the same landscape, the factors leading to that are much broader than border policies. Oops. I'm also going to discuss how the exclusion of families of the missing reveals basically some of the benefits of citizenship and surveillance. And so there's a literature that discusses how state practices of individual identification and surveillance and documentation actually has advantages in terms of allowing rights and services and allowing a certain kind of legibility to the government. And when that goes away, there's vulnerability to things like disappearance and other forms of violence. And then finally, relatedly, just that disappearance at the US-Mexico border just reveals how violent statelessness and non-citizenship can be, and that it's historically a very violent mechanism for control used by totalitarian governments. And we can see at the border some of the ways that statelessness and non-citizenship can really result in human rights violations. So just to start out, this is, kind of literature review, but also very important in case anyone is not so familiar with why there have been thousands of deaths along the US-Mexico border. It's very clearly tied to US government, federal border policies that were enacted in the mid-1990s, generally known as prevention through deterrence. And we can clearly see statistical changes in the number of fatalities directly following prevention through deterrence strategies. And I'll just mention 3 places where there's evidence of this. You can see basically that there was in the policy documents under the Clinton administration in the 1990s, and this is a screenshot from that key policy document called the 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. There's verbiage and diagrams like this that basically predicate the success of the program through assuming that a number of people will lose their lives. There's statistics in Arizona from one medical examiner, the one that I've worked with the most closely over the past almost 16 years, that I'll cover those momentarily. So those statistics are evidence. And then I also want to flag witnessing by migrants themselves and humanitarian actors about state violence that contributes to and directly causes death in this landscape. So 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan signed under President Bill Clinton. You can kind of see the intent there of, these arrows are where they're expecting people will attempt to cross, and then the kind of grayed out areas are the parts of the border that they described as natural deterrence or geographical barriers in the form of desert landscape. There's also language in, this policy document, and I encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to look it up, Border Patrol 1994 Strategic Plan. And it includes language like migrants will find themselves in mortal danger, that the searing heat of the Sonoran Desert will be used as a deterrent. There's a phrase in there that directly states, quote, violence will increase as effects of strategy are felt. And this is just a quote from that 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan, and a photograph that I took of graves of the unidentified in California, which is where the deaths first increased after that 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. Imagery from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, where I've spent significant time, again, mostly of unidentified human remains from the desert borderlands. So I should flag that these numbers, I last updated this about 3 weeks ago. So when it says today, I meant to go in and update the numbers through actually today, but these are a little bit out of date. Somewhere around 3,655 sets of human remains. I should mention that the medical examiner's office does a very careful job of not double counting. So although you might have a cranium found in one GPS location and then years later a mandible found in another, and they're actually from the same individual, those are reconciled genetically. So these are not a double count. And in fact, likely seriously undercount the true number of fatalities, because these are just remains that have been found. And I will tell you, as someone who's spent a lot of time in this landscape, it's a very complicated landscape. It changes depending on monsoon weather. There's a lot of mammal and animal activity, a lot of animals that would consume human remains. There's old mine shafts, there's mesquite, very dense mesquite bosques, forests that make the discovery of human remains very, very, very challenging. And this just really puts into relief what happened after that 1994 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. So you can see 94 policy here, and then the strategy quickly moved to Arizona, and very quickly, within a couple of years, my colleagues at the medical examiner's office here in Tucson were overwhelmed and trying to figure out what was going on and how best to ethically take care of the remains and support the families of the missing. And then just again, data from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, just to highlight the cause of the manner of death. So 44% have been determined to be accidental deaths, due most likely to heat stroke, heat exposure or cold exposure, or falling from a great height in the desert. Sometimes it's difficult to see the washes and to perceive where one's feet are going, especially at night. And then the very high other percentage of unknown fatalities just suggests probably decomposed or skeletal remains where it's very difficult to establish a clear cause of death. And then finally, just to mention, and this is not the focus of my talk, so I'll move through it quickly, but there's direct evidence also. We don't only need the forensic experts and the state vetted numbers to reveal that there's a government responsibility for migrant deaths in the landscape, but we have witness testimony from journalists, from humanitarian aid workers, and most importantly from migrants themselves about the inhumane treatment and disregard for the right to life along the border. Also severe intimidation and arrest of humanitarian aid workers in a landscape where thousands of people are losing their lives. So there's actual prevention of humanitarian aid in this landscape. Okay, I'm going to move through. So getting to what I'm building on this literature, there's been quite a bit of excellent research and writing and statistical analysis of the deaths, of the appearance of human remains in this landscape. And there's been a very little concrete focus on disappearance and the factors for disappearance along the border. What I have perceived over the last 15 years is systematic failure by government agencies to collect DNA samples from the dead in border states. So the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner is somewhat of, is a model, and I'm not talking about that office when I'm talking about this problem. But for instance, well, there are other counties in Arizona where the dead are found, reported to government authorities, and where DNA is not collected. And then most famously, in some of the small counties in Texas, in the southern part of Texas, there's often failure to collect DNA from the dead. Then there's exclusion of the families from DNA services that would be provided to citizens in the US. And I'm gonna especially talk about this today. This is the piece of this problem of disappearance that I've witnessed and experienced the most directly. Again, not as a family, I have to say that with a lot of humility, but as someone who was working closely with families and supporting their claims and doing everything that I could do as a part of an NGO, as a part of various coalitions, as a part of forensic experts at the medical examiner's office to get access for these families. And then finally, the failure to facilitate large-scale genetic comparisons between postmortem DNA and family reference samples. So just in case there's someone who, or anyone who is not as familiar with how forensic human identification works when it comes to genetics, just keep in mind these three things. You have to have DNA or bone, a bone sample from unidentified human remains. You need to have a genetic sample from the relatives of the missing, or a direct sample like a toothbrush or a comb or some hair from the missing person. But usually it's what's called a family reference sample. So close relatives, close biological relatives. And then you have to be able to have a mechanism and a system for comparing all of that data, whether it's one-to-one or on a massive scale. So one-to-one comparison works well if you have a strong identification hypothesis. If you have one set of human remains that you believe is correlated with one missing person, then you can invest in a one-to-one comparison. In this context, where there are thousands of unidentified human remains that have been found in the same landscape and thousands of missing persons, it's trying to figure out one-to-one comparisons. I mean, we started that way when I first started working here in the border context in 2006, 2007. We tried to approach this through highlighting possible, one-to-one comparisons and then begging for funding for DNA comparisons. And it was inefficient and time-consuming and very, very, very difficult for a number of reasons to establish strong identification hypotheses. So starting with the first issue, failure by some government agencies in border states to collect DNA samples. And this is that first part, to collect DNA samples from the unidentified dead. These are all photos from the South Texas context. And I should acknowledge my colleagues took a number of these photos, mostly members of the Forensic Border Coalition. And I will introduce the coalition momentarily. What's happening here on the upper right is student volunteers who are students of either Dr. Kate Spradley or Dr. Lori Baker in Texas, students of forensic anthropologists who are voluntarily conducting massive exhumations in graveyards where unidentified migrants were buried without autopsy or DNA collection. What they found were bodies buried without caskets, several bodies to one grave, many unmarked human remains that had been disposed of in trash bags or milk crates that were very, very close to the surface. A lot of the migrant remains were buried underneath walkways or in corners of these cemeteries, so kind of at the periphery. And it's been an enormous project to try and trace the individual skeletal remains to any government record about when and where that person was found, let alone then examine them using forensic anthropology and collect and process DNA. So one story that I can share briefly, this is a long story, but in the interest of time, this story has been written about by numerous members of the Forensic Border Coalition. Elmer Esau Barahona was from El Salvador, and he crossed, I believe, in 2013 and disappeared in 2013. To make a long story short, he had knee trouble when he was crossing, and it prevented him from continuing. He had a fellow migrant, a traveling companion, who tried to help him and tied his shirt around Elmer's knee. When that man made it to safety, he called Elmer's family and described how he had left Elmer with the shirt tied around his knee. Elmer's aunt actually lived in Texas and visited a sheriff's office in southern Texas. She was shown photographs and she saw this shirt here, a brown and white plaid shirt that had been recovered with the remains of an unidentified person. It was a very strong comparison. She wanted to find out if she could use her DNA for comparison against those remains, and she was told that no DNA had been taken from the remains before they were buried. She was told, actually at the time by a private funeral home, that she would have to pay for the DNA to be collected from the body. She would have to pay for her own family DNA to be collected and processed, which is very expensive. And she would have to pay for the comparison. This is thousands of dollars. She was also told at the time that she would have to pay for the remains that she believed to be Elmer's to be exhumed. So in this case, you can see direct involvement by government actors. And I'm not actually trying to shame and blame individual government actors. What I hope to show in this talk is how bureaucracy is impacted by these violent definitions of people as non-citizens. And so in many cases, maybe not this one, there are government actors who feel that their hands are tied in terms of what they can do, given their position and their mandate and the policies around their work. This one I think was a little bit different. I'm happy to answer more questions about that later. So the other really essential piece, and again, the piece that I witnessed the most and spent the most time working to resolve was the exclusion of families from DNA services provided by the US government. So what happens here, how this happens, and where I see active exclusion. So this is the mother of Marco Antonio Moreno, Camarina, and this photograph was taken by Colibri Center for Human Rights in 2018. She and a number of other families, I'll introduce Nancy Ganoza, who disappeared crossing in 2009, because of either fear or basically refusal. It's very difficult for these families to report someone missing to law enforcement. And unfortunately, in the United States, US law enforcement agencies have a monopoly over missing persons investigations. So if you're a family and you don't make an official missing persons report to a police agency, you really don't have a valid, authentic, real missing persons report. And unfortunately, many law enforcement agencies will turn away these families. The justifications that I was told that families were given were that they should call Border Patrol, that they should call their own country of origin. And there's actually some legal definitions of missing persons in the US that exclude foreign nationals from even being bureaucratically legitimately considered to be missing persons in the US. So regardless of if you are undocumented, they're sometimes in some interpretations of policy, US government agents can view foreign national missing persons as external to the country, even if they disappeared within the United States. Most law enforcement agencies, their policies that we've reviewed very closely at the Forensic Border Coalition suggest that anyone should be able to report someone missing, regardless of the nationality of the missing person or the family. But they usually have to report in person in the same jurisdiction where their loved one disappeared. And that can cause a lot of problems in this context. So turning to Nancy Ganoza, this is illustrative of these issues. So in Nancy's case, so she was from Peru. She crossed in 2009. These photos were provided by the family and used with permission. I'll just highlight briefly what's happening here. This is very common from missing persons reports from families that they're highlighting for the forensic experts. Anything, they're talking about dental conditions or scars or moles on the person's body. And I've written elsewhere in a 2022 article about the forensic expertise and labor and citizenship demands of families of the missing in this process as they search. They really become forensic experts and are a huge part of the process along the border, in terms, especially those processes that that acknowledge the human rights of the disappeared. Nancy disappeared in 2009. Her 2 daughters and former husband were not undocumented, and they had a little bit more privilege, a little bit more ability to travel and make demands. And they traveled to Arizona shortly after her disappearance. It's hard to tell these stories so with such brevity, but for the interest of time, I've written about her elsewhere. So if you'd like to learn more about that story, I'll suggest the 2022 article in Citizenship Studies. But they approached police, and they approached even Border Patrol. They also approached their own Peruvian consulate and the Mexican consulate, and they were turned away by basically all of those authorities. If reports were filed, there was no follow-up, and those missing persons reports did not ever arrive at the medical examiner's office where they could be compared. The most significant of those government refusals of services was that of the Pima County Sheriff's Office that turned away the family, and they said, you cannot prove that Nancy disappeared within our jurisdiction. She probably disappeared on, Tohono O'odham Nation jurisdiction, and you should call Tohono O'odham Police Department. When Nancy's remains were found in 2011, they were found on Tohono O'odham jurisdiction, but I'm speeding through some things here. Basically, the details of the identification revealed that when she disappeared, she was on Pima County jurisdiction. This is just like an invisible border in the middle of the desert. So migrants are not going to know which county they're in or which jurisdiction they're in, let alone their families. So in this case, that refusal of the family back in 2009, it resulted in a almost 10-year delay for the family to learn what happened. Although Nancy's cranium was found in 2011, it was not identified until 2018 because the family did not have access to submit their DNA for comparison. We at Colibri fundraised for private funding at that point to allow families access, even though we recognized that it was some degree of privatization and in a way letting the state off the hook. We decided together with families that were pushing for access that we would fundraise so that they could submit their DNA to a private database, and then we privately funded for comparisons to happen only against Arizona unidentified decedents. Yadira and Julio is another case where there you can see direct action or inaction on the part of the state, on the part of the government. So Irma is mother to both Yadira and Julio. They disappeared crossing actually in 1998, and they've been missing that entire time. They're still missing today. And Irma, despite many interactions with government authorities in both Mexico and the US, she's never been offered the opportunity to submit her DNA for comparison. So she's another family relative whose DNA has been collected by the Colibri Center for Human Rights. And then finally, again, I'm tracing DNA here, but you can see state failure and state action that increases and perpetuates disappearance outside of the DNA practices and policies. But I'm highlighting DNA here because it gives us a little bit of focus and in the interest of time. So that finally, the other third factor is just the failure of massive comparisons. So Colibri Center for Human Rights, like I said, was able to collaboratively establish a mechanism so that families could submit their DNA with a detailed and comprehensive consent and anonymous procedure. And that DNA would be compared massively against the DNA collected from unidentified human remains found only in Arizona. We were able to do that because the local government office, the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in Tucson, is very forward-thinking and progressive in terms of recognizing that new mechanisms need to be created so that these massive comparisons can take place, given all of the bureaucratic problems around forensic services in the US. For Texas, there is no way that families whose loved ones disappeared in Texas can easily submit their DNA for massive comparison unless they go to police and are successful in appealing to the police to provide them with this service. So there's a huge number of identifications. We don't know how many, 100, 500 could be made if there was a mechanism to compare unidentified human remains on the border against family reference data for missing persons on a large scale. These images are just, again, to remind us that for a missing person, you have to have close family relative to submit DNA. And then you also need a mechanism. And this is political because it's not just a technical mechanism, but there needs to be a socio-legal mechanism that allows for the very clearly government managed DNA on the side of the dead, with the ambiguity around who manages DNA information on the side of the missing. Okay, this is my last point. Just thinking through why this is happening. I can mention in the Q&A some of the justifications provided to me and other members of the Forensic Border Coalition over the years for refusals at various points in these problems. I argue that this is not individual level intentional violence on the part of state authorities. There's not an intent to make people disappear. It's not, I don't argue that this is akin to enforced disappearance or political disappearance. But instead, what I think these disappearances reveal is just how violent statelessness can be and lack of citizenship. So there are all sorts of critiques to be had about citizenship, many coming out of critical indigenous studies that are valuable, and I don't have time to get into those here, but just to highlight that there's also some benefits to visibility and legibility on the part of the state, that when that goes away, there's invisibility that can translate into violence. And I'm drawing especially on Hannah Arendt's work, as well as some theorists that have looked at bureaucracy and papers, and more recently, how these theories and histories relate to undocumented immigrants in the United States. Looks like I forgot my acknowledgement slide, but I can drop it in the chat. And with that, I will stop. I went a little over, but I'm really excited to chat with you all.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that fascinating conversation about a very interesting topic, also a very sad topic in many ways. I'm just going to very quickly ask a question, make a comment and ask a question, and then I will pass it to other people in the Zoom room to start the conversation. Coincidentally, I grew up in the Mexican border, on the Mexican side, not very far away from Arizona, actually in Mexicali, which is like San Luis Rio Colorado, very close to the area that you're talking about. And one comment that when I was growing up, one comment that we would always be making, or that people would always make, is that, and this is after the 1990s, right? That the border was never closed, right? That the border was actually partially open for those who could survive. And the assumption there was that those who could survive the desert, but also those who could survive any other kind of violence associated with, you know, the difficulties of crossing the border, right? So I just wanted to see if at some point you can comment a little bit on that, right? On the fact that, I mean, people like me growing up in the border, middle class life with visas to cross to the US whenever we wanted, we would always see these people coming from not only from Mexico, many other parts of Central America, and we would know that these people were, especially because of the heat, right? That these people were highly likely to die, right? And so that there was that kind of knowledge that these people are just passing right next to us right now, and they're going to die at some point on the Mexican side or on the American side. So there was that, when I was growing up, there was always that idea that only the fittest would be the ones that would make it, and actually that's what normally happens. And I really appreciate that in your talk or in this conversation, you're highlighting the state failure, right? And you're exemplifying somehow state failure through the failure at collecting DNA and providing DNA data to families and others to be able to identify the bodies. But I was also wondering if you have any idea or any data on kind of the Mexican side of that state failure too, right? Because one of the comments that you always hear on Mexico when we talk about people coming from other parts of Central America, but also Mexicans live in Mexico, is that you know, Mexico is kind of a failed, I'm not saying Mexico is a failed state, but people talk about the failures of the Mexican state to protect these individuals that are moving through Mexican territory and that are crossing the border. I wonder how many people die on the Mexican side, and we have no structure whatsoever in Mexico to actually or interest at all to go in the desert and try to identify or find or identify bodies, right? So I was just wondering about if you know something about that, because when you talk about the border, I mean, for me, having grown up there, the border starts long before the border on the Mexican side, right? And there are a lot of people also dying before crossing the border. And obviously, as you have shown today, also many of them die or pass away on the other side of the border. So these are just kind of a little bit convoluted thoughts that I got from your talk, and I just wanted to see if you could address. I mean, is there even an attempt to measure and identify bodies on the Mexican side, or this is only something that happens on the American side? And then after you respond to this, maybe we can just open to other people in the room.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Roberto. Yeah, I acknowledge this talk as I've put it together today is very like US side centric. And I am in the fuller length article engaging much more with Mexican scholars who are looking at disappearance and state failure within Mexico. It's a slightly different, it complicates things in the sense that the factors behind state failure in Mexico are a little bit different. The shape is a little bit different, but it's very similar. But you know, in terms of looking at the disappearance on the US side, part of the reason why there's kind of a little bit of a myopic view in the literature, and myself included, on the US side is because it's visible. You know, at least in Arizona, those little red dots on the work of the medical examiner and some of the other humanitarian groups, there's visibility there, and there's numbers that we can work with, and there's state authorities that we can work with. And you're right, on the Mexican side, it is a lot more complicated. There's invisibility. If you take the postmortem side as one problem and the missing person side or the disappearance side as another problem of a related dynamic, in Arizona, at least, one side of that is visible, which is the dead. When you go to Sonora, both sides are invisible. It's very difficult it's very, very difficult to make identifications, and it's also difficult, therefore, to analyze what's going on in terms of practice. However, of course, there are Mexican scholars looking at this. I'm working closely with Dr. Natalia Mendoza Rockwell, who has worked with several groups in Sonora that are led by mothers of the disappeared, Madres Buscadoras. Yeah. And they are working very hard to bridge these gaps left by the state. And we're working with them and with some of the forensic volunteers in Arizona to compare and contrast those two settings in terms of the state, in terms of the landscape, in terms of the context of the disappearances. So in Sonora, they are more likely to be homicide. They are more likely to be victims of cartel violence or, state cartel collusion violence, more likely to be mass graves, more likely to be Central American or at least from another state within Mexico. So yes, they're related problems. There's also a number of scholars working in Mexico more broadly about disappearance and what the families who have lost a loved one to disappearance within Mexico and Central America are enduring. It's such a big literature and another set of historical and contextual factors. So I'm like kind of overwhelmed trying to piece through connecting it at the moment. But one other thing that I'll highlight is there have been serious problems with consulates. So families who know that they their loved one disappeared on the U.S. side, they're basically struggling with the failure of two states, or in my colleague Natalia's words, dealing with two abusive states. And, you can see that in Nancy's case, their family dealt with three, the US, Peru, and Mexico, because she had a false document in like a Mexican false ID card. And so the family went to the Mexican authorities for assistance, and they were, greeted with very criminalizing language. There have been some interesting efforts on the part of the Mexican government to fund DNA comparisons in Arizona, and that work should be highlighted. And it's interesting and it's significant that the majority of, I'm not sure statistically, but a large percentage of the unidentified human remains samples that have been collected and processed relevant to Arizona were funded by the were funded by the Mexican government through the Tucson office of the Mexican consulate. And I guess one other thing that I would highlight is, working locally, there's diversity. There are local forensic bureaucrats from both countries who are very committed to identification, who respond humanely to the families, who are scratching their heads trying to figure out how they can open up these barriers for families, and they encounter a violent bureaucracy that's almost a system with nobody in it on both sides. So yeah, and kind of a mishmash response. It's a complicated dynamic, and it's beyond individual actors, on both sides of the border.
I just think that point that you made about the two abusive states is really important for people to understand the dynamic and how it has changed over the last 2 or 3 decades, especially because historically speaking, I don't know, in the 1980s or even before that, the greatest numbers of immigrants crossing the border or migrants crossing the border between the US and Mexico would have been Mexicans and sometimes smaller numbers of Central Americans, people from Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, right? But in the last 15 or 20 years, and you are, I guess, you must be very aware of this, I mean, you're an expert. Certainly the dynamic has changed, right? And we can also talk about geopolitics here in the sense that the last few American administrations have been pressuring on the Mexican government to also take a tough stance against those who are non-nationals, as you were saying, non-citizens, stateless individuals crossing through Mexican territory, right? So there's been a massive change on the Mexican side in dealing with these individuals in very violent ways, because back in the day when the people moving from central Mexico or southern Mexico to the border were Mexican citizens, the oppression was there and the violence was there, but the oppression was not that hard, because as Mexican citizens, they would have the right to walk all the way to the border, right? Whereas when many scores of Central American and South Americans started coming, then the policy changed in a very interesting way to make of several Mexican administrations now can be characterized as what you're saying, very oppressive, abusive states that are acting against what we call our brothers, in ways that we would have never imagined that a Mexican state was going to be doing that to people just trying to cross the border, right? So certainly a very interesting point. Thank you very much, Robin. So if you're okay with this, Robin, I would like to open to other people in the room. We have more than 20 people, so maybe we can take a number of questions, and then Robin would decide how she wants to address the questions. So anybody?
And while people are thinking, I'll just pick up on another thread that you mentioned at the beginning of your comments. And thank you very much for your comments; they're helpful. About the myth of the border being closed. It's never been closed, and it's a great myth that that it ever could be. It's this nationalistic imaginary, but for those of you not as familiar with the specific history of the U.S.-Mexico border. There's an excellent history, May M. Ngai, called Impossible Subjects, that really shows how the border was constructed as a labor control filter mechanism, that basically a valve that could control the flow of labor to especially agribusiness in the US, and how those two histories are totally intertwined. And the US could not have had the agricultural boom without A, Mexican territory, and B, Mexican labor that's been imported using the border as a valve to either inject more labor or deport inconvenient and troublesome laborers. So yeah, it's that history continues, and even with all of the language about the wall and walling things off, it's a mythological project. So
we have a question by L.A. Senecal. Can you open your microphone, please?
Hi there. My name's Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Can you just tell us where you're from, affiliation, and then?
Sure. So I also am from the States, but I am working on my PhD in Portugal. So I'm in Lisbon, Portugal right now.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about, there's a Chicano saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us. It's, in reference to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, I think. So this is something I'm just thinking of in terms of the conversation you're having. But I was wondering, Robin, I wanted you to speak more about this, one of the goals of your talk from the beginning, to kind of circle back to it, about how migrants and families receive all the disadvantages of surveillance and none of its advantages. I think, so I'm doing a project on the EU borders, and I'm using Malta as a case study. So this really resonates. There's so much surveillance, right? And there's so much that goes into identifying people who do make such crossings. And, in Malta, people are still detained despite the fact that they're not supposed to be. But a person is not let out of detention until they're identified. And for me, that was something I'm really curious about, like the distinction between living and dead migrants, and this identification process, and sort of the energy and the resources that go into it, the differences there. So I wondered if you could speak more about that. And thank you so much for your talk. It's been lovely.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, thanks for your comment. And we should talk. It'd be interesting to just compare, what you're observing there in Malta and what I've observed here. Yeah, I'm definitely still working through this theoretically and, looking at other contexts. But I guess one of the things that I would highlight is, notice how okay, how difficult it is for, say a family knows that their loved one is in detention somewhere, they've been apprehended, maybe they heard from a fellow traveler, or maybe that person got a phone call, which is not normal, which is another huge problem. So the family knows they're in detention. It's very difficult to even track someone within Border Patrol detention. So there's misspellings, indigenous names especially, but also just Spanish names are butchered in these bureaucratic record keeping. So there's a construction of criminalized visibility to the state in terms of a marked or stigmatized body, but there's inconsistency then in terms of that state actually being able to track that person in another context. So if we look at what happened with the family separations under the Trump administration, that is a perfect example of how this highly surveillance state was unable or unwilling, but I think unable to trace many of the families and reunite those children with their parents. There's another, similar situation with, I think the number was 65,000, 65,000 immigrants that are kind of asylum seekers that are lost to the state. So brushing over, some particulars there, but just that there's deep inconsistencies also outside of the forensic decedent context, where you can see a particular kind of legibility, and I think it's a categorical legibility, and then an individual illegibility, and an individual. Susan Bibler-Coutin's work is really good on this, legalizing moves, and then a 2005, I believe it's an American Anthropologist article, where she writes about a state of non-being. Hannah Arendt also writes about this in terms of statelessness. So there's a lot of interesting and troublesome contradictory, processes of enforced invisibility that is attended by a surveillance regime. So, a lot of other immigration scholars have written about the denial of rights and the immigrant struggle for rights in the United States context. The struggle for visibility, struggle for access to medical care, to any of the benefits of citizenship. So it's that literature that I'm also engaging with.
So there are two more questions. Lisa, do you need to say something else, or are you okay? Good, thank you very much. So we have Felician and Thomas. I think Felician was the first one who raised his hand. You want to go ahead, Felician?
I don't know. I think Thomas was first.
Oh, okay. It's okay. Who goes first?
Okay. I don't. Do you hear me like this? Because I don't know if.
Yeah, it's perfectly
okay,
fine.
perfect.
Go ahead. Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and to see all of these colleagues and people from all around the world get to it. So it's fantastic. So thanks a lot for this fantastic presentation, and congratulations to your great work, Robin, both as an activist, as a biological and social anthropologist. So I'm very, very impressed. And I was wondering if you have any insights about number of cases of matching identification that you could do at the forensic lab you are working between, well, missing corpses, missing identities based on identified corpses, and the requests of the family members. So just to have some insight about it, and maybe more generally along the Mexican US border, but I don't know if these numbers are available. And I don't know if you followed some cases where, or if you heard about some cases of repatriation of the remains after the identification. How was this process? Because it's what I learned from some professors I had in Argentina, because I did my BA there. is that, for instance, the Argentine team of forensic anthropologists, which is very famous, and I'm sure you are closer with, is that they deal with both this work of biological identification, work with the family members, involvement in justice process. So it's a big implication. I don't know if you followed also these kind of steps after identification. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to pull up a web page that looks like the link is broken right now, but so with your first question, identification success, at least on the forensic side, which then connects to your next question. So for Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, about 65% of the remains that have been found over the last 2 decades have been identified. And if you search Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner dashboard, they have a up-to-date site where they track identification metrics. And so here in this particular part of Arizona, that there have been quite a lot of successes. There's a lot of collaborative work. Again, we have a medical examiner, medical legal authority that's creative and very grounded in forensic ethics, and they have some degree of autonomy, just given the way that the medical examiner system is different from, for instance, the coroner system. Border-wide, we don't have those statistics in terms of how many people have been identified versus how many remains continue to be unidentified. But I predict that the unidentified vastly outnumber the identified once you bring in Texas statistics. And this talk just brushes the surface of why that is likely to be the case. Anyway, systematic record keeping problems, lack of DNA, all sorts of issues. So Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, I'm glad that you mentioned them. They are also a founding member of the Forensic Border Coalition. And so we've worked very closely together over the last 10 years on this struggle and pressuring various parts of the US federal government to provide access, to provide a mechanism for massive comparisons. And Colibri, actually, our DNA program, including the notification procedure, was modeled after the Argentine team's protocols. And they were they're just really an excellent example of collaborative approach and really building relationships and capacity and partnerships with smaller, locally grounded, forensic civil society groups. And they have a history of this throughout Latin America, and Colibri is a part of it. So Colibri, little NGO out of Arizona, really was mentored by the Argentine team. So it's very much in the spirit of their approach. But yeah, the notifications is a whole other aspect that's complicated. It takes in-depth relationship building, trust. For an identification to be successful, the family must be a part of that process. And unfortunately, I think this is another reason why there are still more unidentified remains than we realize, which is that when families are notified by state authorities, too often it's not done in their native language, it's done over the phone. The families are not provided enough evidence or explanation. They're just asked to trust these abusive state, representatives. And it resolves nothing for the family. So again, it's another kind of complicated side of things. I guess I'll also mention here relatedly that there are many families who do not invest in the technology of DNA as a valid mechanism for truth. I'm specifically focused here on those that are asking for that technology, but it's not universal. And there are other ways of knowing and other mechanisms for identification that can be used, and some of which are valid to the forensic experts and authorities, and some of which are not. But anyway, yeah, I hope that sort of brushes on some of what you were addressing there. And thank you for the questions and comments.
Any follow-up, Felician? No?
Yeah, it's good,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
As far as I understand, so you mean that in most of cases, so 65% of the cases, you reach to identify the genetic profile of the corpse But do you also wish to match this profile with the DNA profile of the family members? I'm not sure if I got it or not.
Yeah, no, sorry. The 65%, that's the number, that's the percentage of the dead that have been found in Arizona that have been identified broadly, whether it was DNA or fingerprinting or dental records or something else, tattoo recognition, something like that. That's the entire, that's not just DNA success. Getting into the DNA, I should update myself with those metrics. It's tricky, tricky for a number of reasons, but Colibri, for the first couple of years of our DNA program, we had about a 10 or 12% match rate. So between, and that's just for Arizona. So families who knew that their loved one disappeared in Arizona submitted their DNA for comparison. About 10% of the time, we were able to find their missing person among the dead. That's just with the Colibri, first 3 or 4 years of the DNA program.
And in this case, was the repatriation of the remains possible or asked by the family members?
Oh gosh, it's a whole other thing. Yeah, it's a whole other, that's a whole other scenario that
I'm wondering, that's right.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
There are a couple of good articles about that. If you email me, I can send you one article that really comes to mind about repatriation. Yeah, email me.
Thank you.
Great. Should we go to Thomas's question, Thomas?
Yeah. Oh, you're on mute?
Yeah, you're muted.
I'm here. Okay, hello, Robin. So thank you very much for this presentation. It's so interesting. Yeah, and it resonates really, Felicien was absolutely right. It resonates immensely with the forensic studies that we have here in Europe, especially on the Mediterranean area. And a bit of promotion, we've got many presentation and webinars on the Thanatic website that reflect this part of the research here in Europe. I'm thinking of Maurice Steele, his presentation at the Oxford conference, and the Karolina Kobelinski as well. On the she gave another webinar. And well, I'm not mentioning the US scholars like Ellie Delano, you already know her. And Charles Heller as well, as the Forensic Studies Center as well. So you can find this presentation on the website, on the Thanatic website, and many others as well. And thank you for pointing to the document of the border control strategic plan. I was not aware that the unofficial document could be so explicit and could use such a wording. And I was wondering personally if we could find a similar case in the similar wording in EU documents or Frontex documents. Maybe Lisa know more about that. I don't know, but yeah, really it's a shock. Right? I was really surprised. But my question is more about the people who live in this desert. You said it's a sacred place for the indigenous people, and I was wondering whether these people was retaining some rights on this land, and whether what is their reaction? What is their perception? Is there any mobilization with regard to this death?
Complicated question. I would first just highlight my deep humility in addressing that, because I'm not an indigenous person, and I have not spent enough time understanding the diversity of perspectives among O'odham people. My Tohono O'odham friends are people who put out water in the desert and people who search for the missing in the desert. And they are somewhat controversial within the O'odham nation for a number of reasons. Again, I don't feel I'm necessarily the right person to represent this, but my perspective, what little I've gathered is, O'odham sovereignty has been violated repeatedly in this landscape in a number of ways. So if you actually look at the Tohono O'odham nation boundaries, it is a trans-border, it crosses the border. San Miguel Gate is what remains of that traditional space of movement, and it's very controlled. It's unfortunately, O'odham people who live in Sonora and O'odham people who live in Arizona have been really separated because of the wall. There's also constant intrusions by all sorts of actors, not just the US federal state, also by cartels, also by sometimes humanitarians, by militia people into the sovereign Tohono O'odham nation. So there's a lot of harm that's been caused by the politics surrounding the border. There's complicated politics at every level there. I think a lot of O'odham people, if someone is traveling through, they will help them and provide water. Doing that on a larger scale has generally been really controversial, especially for the tribal councils. So yeah, and I should also modify, I am not correct in saying that the entire space is a sacred space, but to mention that there are many sacred places within this territory that's kind of been brushed aside as violent, killing, ugly, horrible, vicious desert, So in my opening remarks, I meant to highlight that it's much more complicated than that, and we have to be very careful about how we discuss this landscape as a dangerous place. It's been constructed to be a dangerous place. With that said, there's a nice brief Ofelia Zepeda essay that you can find. I'll put her name here in the chat about the desert and the wild places and the difference between, I can't remember the name of the essay, but here's her name and you can find it. The difference between the wild places in the desert and the cleared, safer, more human places. So there's, acknowledgement that it can be a dangerous place. It is an extreme climate, but civilizations have thrived here for millennia, and it is home. And so, I was corrected early on in my work, some of my writing, in describing, some of the places where migrants are pushed as inhospitable, remote, uninhabited. And we need to be careful about that language. It's, those spaces have been violently abused by federal policy, as you can see reflected in that documentation. And, there are deserts around the world that have been used in this way, kind of abused as a zone of control or lack of, suspension of rights, or nuclear experimental zones, disposal zones. And they are often home to indigenous people. So there's another layer of geographical violence happening there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Robin. Is there, maybe we have 1 or 2 more minutes for one final question from anybody that feels the need to ask the most important question? Anybody? If no one has any more questions, I would like to maybe just give you 1 or 2 more minutes, Robin, if you wish, in case you want to address any or make any other comments or make any concluding remark or any ideas that are passing through your mind as we speak.
Oh, gosh, so many things. No, it's just a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. And I very much appreciate your questions and comments. It's helpful, very helpful for me. And thank you, Bidisha, and all of you at Thanatic Ethics for inviting me and working with me. It's been a very difficult semester. It's good now, the sun is shining, but it's been a rough time. So we had to reschedule at least once. I know I was a hassle on email. I really appreciate your patience.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
It's a treat to do this. And thank you, Thomas, for highlighting. I'm excited to this summer, when I have finally some time to sit still, watch more of the webinars.
Yeah, please feel free to stay in touch if you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would love to. You all as well.
Thank you very much, Robin. So I'll pass it back to Bidisha in case Bidisha wants just to make any small comments before we close the session. Thank you very much, Bidisha, also for inviting me.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you,
interesting.
Roberto. Now I'll just close by thanking both of you, Robin and Roberto, for a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Robin. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you so
Good.
much.
Thank you.
And we'll
My
see you
pleasure.
all, yeah, next month for our last webinar of the series.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Get some rest.
Yeah, I'm going to sleep right now. Bye-bye.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you guys. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
Bye, Felicia.
Good to see you all.
Good to see you, Lisa.